Welcome, dear friends. Good evening. Namaskar. So, we begin our eighth session, Artsy Clicking Sessions, session 8, and we'll be talking about how much light is enough and how to measure the light. So, today we'll be talking about the tools that measure light for our camera. Just as measuring tape is used to measure length, and while cooking, ingredients are measured by a weighing scale. For light, our camera has light meter, which has stops just as a scale has inches and centimeters to measure light. Today we will talk about how it works in semi-automatic and automatic modes and aperture and shutter priority modes. So how the light meter works, we'll be discussing today. We'll be discussing stops of light which are used for measuring light and how the light meter works in aperture value mode, how the light meter works in time value mode, light metering issues, how the light meter deals with light and dark tones, resolving exposure issues with exposure composition, compensation, and take home points. So, why is the light meter important? Here we have an overexposed shot, and this is of an important function. So, what will happen if we do not understand how this has happened and do not know how to correct it? We will fail to catch correct exposure and spoil our important photos of a very important function. So, why is light meter important? One might say one can deal with it in post processing. If we get an overexposed shot or if we get a underexposed shot, like this is an underexposed shot, you may say that we can deal with it in post processing using editing software. But then, how long are we going to sit in front of the computer editing and making corrections? Some faults cannot be corrected, for one might lose on the details in an overexposed photograph, or one might introduce a lot of noise in an underexposed photograph after editing. Our aim should be to utilize post production for creative effects and not losing time on editing instead of using that time to choose settings while shooting. So why is light meter important? Light meter is a tool we are going to use to measure light entering our camera to get that perfectly exposed photograph. So light meter is used for getting a perfectly exposed photograph so that you don't waste time in your post-processing software editing it. So now what is a light meter and where do you find it? So this is a camera and this is the LCD. So this scale which you see here, if you are able to see, let me pick up the laser pointer. This scale which you see here from -3 to +3, this is the light meter. How many of you have seen this light meter in your camera? If not, then you must be able to recognize it for better shots. So this is the shutter speed, this is the aperture or f-stop, and this is a different stop. This is light meter, and it is the scale used to measure light inside the camera. And it is measured, this 1, 2, 3, plus 1, 2, 3, and minus 1, 2, 3 are the stops on this light meter. So in auto and semi-auto modes, when shutter is pressed halfway, the camera starts adjusting the aperture and shutter speed to get the right amount of light into the camera to get a perfectly exposed photograph. So this you must have seen when you pick up your camera and point it in differently lit areas. Suppose you go outside the room and press the shutter halfway, you see the shutter speed and the aperture are changing every moment. You are changing the direction of your camera on pressing the shutter button halfway. This is because in auto mode, the camera tries to pick up an appropriate shutter speed and aperture value and makes a change and adjusts how much light is entering your camera. So light meter is responsible for measuring and calculating this light amount which is entering the camera, and it then makes the adjustments accordingly in auto mode. So we can see here that if we look around, we see objects because the objects reflect the artificial light around us. And because of this reflection of light, we are able to see the objects. In most scenes in this world, the objects reflect 12 to 18% of the light that falls on them. Why should one know this? Because this principle is directly related to photography. And utilizing this, the light meter works. So light meter is calibrated, and in auto mode, light meter will use settings so as to reproduce an image as it looks through the viewfinder by making the adjustments and adjusting the light. So we will come back to it, but before that, let us try to understand what does a stop mean on a light meter. So stop is a language in which our camera talks and is a term which denotes a measurement of light. A stop in photography refers to a measure of light. A stop either doubles or halves the amount of light that goes inside your camera to create a scene. Anytime you double the amount of light getting into the camera sensor, you are increasing the light by one stop. That is the plus sign in your light meter. Anytime you half the amount of light getting inside the camera sensor, you are decreasing the light by one stop. That is -1 on your light meter. So stops are displayed in light meter. Here you can, this is a viewfinder, and when you see through your viewfinder, you find some numbers written here below. And they represent your shutter speed, your aperture value, your ISO, and here's in the center you find the light meter, which is a scale from -3 to +3 or -2 to +2. And if you press the info button or use the LCD, you find it here on your LCD. So I hope I have made it clear where you can find your light meter. Do try to locate it in your camera and use it. If after this session you are not able to locate it, search for it using your camera manual. Most light meters go from +2 to -2, and some go from +3 to -3. So a light meter looks like this, and the numbers are stops: +1 stop, +2 stop, +3 stop, -1, -2, and -3 stops. 0 means when the camera is receiving the correct amount of light and is based on 18% reflection to reproduce an image similar to the scene which you are trying to photograph. So one can say 0 indicates that camera is receiving the correct amount of light, and in most cases this is going to be 100% correct. This concept is also utilized in manual mode when one aims to get the light meter reading to 0 by adjusting shutter speed and aperture to get the right exposure. For here you can be creative. Suppose we press the shutter halfway and the light meter is at 1. It indicates here, this is at 1. So it indicates that our camera has one stop more light than required to reproduce the scene in the question, which in turn means that the camera has twice the amount of light required for the correct exposure of the scene. If on +2, can anyone tell me how much light is coming in? Because I told you that for 1, it is double the amount. So for 2, it is 4 times the amount of light required to reproduce a scene. So +1 stop doubles the amount of light getting inside the camera and reaching the sensor than is needed to correctly expose the scene. +2 stops indicates 4 times of the light getting into and reaching the sensor that is needed to correctly expose the scene. And +3 stops means 8 times the amount of light getting inside the camera and reaching the sensor than is needed to correctly expose the scene. Suppose we press the shutter halfway and the light meter is at -1. It indicates that our camera has one stop less light than required to reproduce the scene in the question, which in turn means that the camera has half the amount of light required for the correct exposure of the scene. Suppose we press the shutter halfway and the light meter is at -2. It indicates that our camera has 2 stops less light than required to reproduce the scene in question, which in turn means that the camera has 1/4 the amount of light required for the correct exposure of the scene. So -1 stop is half the amount of light reaching inside the camera and reaching the sensor than is needed to correctly expose and recreate a scene. -2 stops is 4 times light getting to this less light getting to the sensor than is needed to correctly expose and capture the scene correctly. minus 3 stops means 8 times less light is getting inside the sensor and reaching the sensor than is needed to correctly expose and get the right exposure onto the sensor. Now, after I have explained this, it sounds so theoretical that it may appear to be a daunting task. But once you get practicing and recognizing it, it comes to you automatically. So you have to practice to get your photographs right. So what is a correct exposure? Just as I said, for correct exposure, you have to have your light meter at 0 when you press the shutter halfway. So this is a correctly exposed photograph with the light meter at 0. And light meter 0 also means that capturing the light as it was at the time when the shot was taken. So one can choose to have a brighter exposure or a darker exposure. Suppose you are shooting in the morning or in the evening and the scene appears dull, you may choose to keep your light meter at -1 or +1, depending on what exposure you want. So one can choose to have a brighter exposure or a darker exposure of the scene for a creative effect as per one's choice. So this is +1 stop exposure, and though the picture appears brighter, but one can make out that one has lost the details here uh, in the crop that is growing in the field, and also the building appears too bright, and the details are not that well outlined. So it is an overexposed shot with light meter at +1. Suppose you get it at +2, you have an overexposed photo with blown out highlights. So even if you work on it in post processing, you won't be able to get the details in these blown out highlights. This is when the light meter is at -1, the exposure is underexposed, but to me it appears better than when it was at 0. So one can say that it is a technical thing, but depends on the subject, and one can opt for keeping the light meter at -1 or +1. So here it is subjective and preference differs from person to person, and someone may like this shot better, like I like it better. At -2, the exposure is darkened 4 times, and here we have lost the details in the shadows here. And if you want to work it up in post processing, you will get a lot of noise even if you get the exposure correct. So devote time and look at your light meter while shooting to get that uh, cursor at 0. And if you don't get a perfect shot and it looks underexposed or overexposed, you can always shoot at +1 or -1. Or you can take a series of shots. We'll be talking about it later. So if we keep all the photographs in one line, this is at 0, light meter is 0, light meter at 1, light meter at +2, and we can see the difference. So in all the semi-manual modes or auto modes, one will always see the light meter stay at 0. Or you may not find the light meter at all. For camera chooses all the settings, and the disadvantage being one cannot choose the depth of field or cannot choose the blur needed for a motion, for one is only getting the right amount of concentrated and getting the right amount of light here. So in semi automatic modes, one loses one's creativity. And that is why manual mode is important, and we'll be talking about it in the later lessons. So now we come to using light meter in aperture value mode, and as learnt in previous lessons, aperture value mode is denoted on the dial by the letter A. So A on the dial indicates aperture priority mode, and one can choose the aperture size here to control the depth of field, and the camera controls all the other settings to maintain the correct amount of light entering the camera to reproduce the replica of the scene. So what controls the light amount here? We have fixed the aperture. What will control the light amount here? Yes, it is shutter speed. ISO 2 has a role, but we'll be talking about it later. So this is another example of aperture priority mode. Suppose I want a narrow depth of field, and I just want the photograph to photograph this child in front and blur all the others standing in the background. So just I want this depth. So I keep my the aperture of the camera at 2.8, that is the lowest aperture, and that means that the aperture is wide open and a lot of light is entering your camera. To balance that, the camera increases the shutter speed and it keeps it at 1 by 125 so that it is successful in lessening the amount by increasing the shutter speed. Suppose I want to uh, keep the depth so that 3 children are accurately focused. So I keep the aperture at 11, and here, because the aperture value is high, so the aperture itself has a lesser diameter, and so less light is entering inside your camera. To balance that, the shutter speed slows down and it adjusts to 1 by 8. So this is controlled by the camera and this is controlled by you. And the camera controls the shutter speed to get the light meter at 0. If you set the aperture at 22 so that all the children are in focus, that is the depth. If you increase the depth of the field, say you are photographing a distant mountain and you want everything to be in focus, you have to have a very big aperture, so you keep it at 22. Now the camera will adjust the shutter speed at a much lower speed, that is half 1 by 2. And this will introduce a camera shake if your camera is not on a tripod, as we discussed in the previous classes sessions, that for a focal length, if you know the focal length at which you are shooting, 1 by that focal length should be the shutter speed to avoid camera shake. So here you need a tripod, and here the camera is adjusting the amount of light by decreasing the shutter speed because you have uh, narrowed the aperture, and camera is taking up the shutter speed so that the light meter reads 0. Now shutter priority mode. What happens in if you choose shutter priority mode? So you are choosing the shutter priority mode and the camera will uh, now adjust the aperture to get that light meter reading to 0. So if we choose shutter or TV mode, we will control the shutter speed and camera will control the aperture to increase or decrease the amount of light entering for the right exposure. See, so I took this shot, and for this shot, uh, I took the shutter speed for 2 seconds because I wanted that soft appearance of the waterfall, and it could be created only by a long exposure. And to balance the light entering the camera and to get the light meter at 0, my camera chose the focal length of 22. See, everything is very well in focus. That indicates that the depth of field is great, or has a higher value, and so you get this photograph. Suppose you want the fall to be partially frozen. Like in this shot, you chose a shutter speed of 1 by 100. So uh, the flow of water is frozen a bit. And because the shutter speed is not that fast, the camera chose the aperture to get the light meter at 0 as f9. In another shot where I wanted to freeze the water droplets, I chose a higher value for my shutter speed, and I chose 1 by 500, and so this was a very fast shutter speed, and that would let in very less light. So to balance that, my camera chose the aperture 5.6 to get the light meter at 0. So what I'm trying to say is that if we are using semi-automatic modes, the camera will try to auto-adjust the amount of light entering to maintain the unseen light meter at 0 by adjusting other available parameters available to it. I hope I'm clear. So there exist some conditions within this too, because we know that light meter works on the principle to make the settings so that 18% of light enters to reciprocate the scene, re, uh, reproduce the scene, but sometimes even this fails because it treats as if all the tones were same. Like if you pick up the colors black, white, blue, red, each color reflects a different amount of light. And how can we understand it, this aspect? Suppose I ask you, on a bright sunny day, why do we wear a white t-shirt? Well, we wear it because white color reflects all the light and doesn't absorb that much. So uh, we don't feel the heat of the day. And if you live in a colder climate, you would like to wear a dark shirt. So camera assumes that each object reflects 18% of the light. So it assumes that both white and black reflect an equal amount of light and makes adjustments according to that to keep the light meter at 0. But it is not so, because we know that black color absorbs more of the light, whereas white reflects more of the light. So this causes some images to be overexposed and some images to be underexposed in bright and dark scenes. Like this is a darker tone, black on black. This is a lighter tone, white on white. And camera assumes that both these scenes, black on black and white, are reflecting 18% of the light falling on them, and it makes adjustments according to that. Remember, black absorbs more light and white reflects more light. So bright scenes will come out underexposed because it is reflecting more amount of light, whereas light meter is adjusting according to 18% of light. So while light and bright scenes will appear underexposed, and with light meter at 0, you will get this shot instead of this shot. And for a darker scene, you will get a brighter picture, and the scene will come out overexposed. So dark scene will come out brighter, like this is bright, and this is when light meter is at 0, where actually the scene is like this. So here comes in the role of exposure compensation. The button you see as AV plus minus. So in such conditions where though the light meter is showing you the value of 0, but you're getting an underexposed or overexposed shot, you hold this button down and rotate the dial to move the cursor to change the stop. And depending on what you are getting, overexposed or underexposed shot, you will move it to +1 or -1 or +2 or -2. And remember, exposure compensation is not used in manual mode. It is only used in semi-automatic modes. So change exposure compensation so that light meter reads -1 to double the amount of light, and 1 gets the right exposure. So in this scene, which had come out underexposed, if you uh, choose the press the exposure compensation button, rotate the dial, and get your cursor at +1, you will get double the amount of light inside the camera, and you will get the correct exposure. Once you change the exposure compensation for a photograph, change it back to the normal after the shot, for it will stay there if not changed, compromising on future shots. Similarly here, you will use exposure compensation to get your cursor at -1 so that you get this correct exposure, because it had come out as overexposed shot. So to sum up how the light meter works, we have seen what stops of light mean. We have also seen how the light meter works in aperture value mode. We have seen how the light meter works in time value mode or shutter priority mode. We have understood light metering issues. We have understood how the light meter deals with light and dark tones or lighter and darker scenes. And we have learned to resolve the exposure issues for brighter and darker scenes by using exposure compensation. So next session will be shutter priority mode, and we won't be having on the next Saturday. It will be 15 days from now that we'll have our next session. And any queries are welcome at my email ID tandanarchana@gmail.com or WhatsApp number 7599295951. Next session will not be on the coming Saturday, but it will be from after 15 days from today. So this is all for today. Good night and namaskar. Enjoy your dinner and do practice by taking some shots to understand the role of light meter and role of exposure compensation. Thank you, friends. Thank you for logging in.